All right, welcome everybody. I assume everybody can hear me. Um, I'll bet you can. So let's go ahead and get started. Today, we're talking about ownership, property, land descriptions. That's, by the way, a lot of fun. Estates and syndicates, which is, this is lesson number one. You don't have to start with lesson number one. They are all independent modules. The focus of the material is what does the Department of Real Estate want you to know to pass the real estate licensing exam. So in property ownership, we don't talk much about public property ownership because, well, it's not on the state exam. But what we will be talking about is pretty much everything else that's on this list. Private ownership can be by an individual, it could be with other people, and it also could be with legal entities, which we're going to, go through. And we're going to start off with the word property. And property is a what issue, a what question. Now, legally, let's put it this way. Most of the time, if you ask a lot of people, what is property? The answer might be things that are owned by people, right? Property is a thing that somebody owns. Legally and more technically, the word property does not really refer to the thing, but it refers to the rights and interests which somebody has in the thing, rights or interests. And those rights or interest is called a bundle of rights. And the bundle of rights include a bunch of different things: the right to possess, the right to use, the right to sell, the right to enter, to give away, to lease. To encumber means to borrow money against it, as well as other things, to dispose of it, to exclude, and also to do nothing. And we're going to talk again about what it means to exclude. Not everything is property. So let's say I own the building, right? I own the land, but I don't own the air that is in the building or the land, because the air is a migratory substance. It's a fugitive substance. It moves around. Can you own air? And the answer is yes, if you capture it, if you sell it to a scuba diver, if you have to put coins in a box in order to fill up your tires. So air, when captured, can be owned, but air in its natural state is not subject to ownership because I don't have any control over it and I cannot exclude others. Just like wild animals, right? I own land. Do I own the squirrels and the rabbits and the mice that are running around and the birds that are flying? No, because they're also migratory, fugitive animals and not subject to ownership. Now, if I captured them and I created a little, zoo, it's kind of creepy, then I could own them. But if I don't have the ability to control something and I cannot exclude other people from using it, then I don't own it. All of our rights are subject to government powers. Government powers we're going to talk about later. Police power is cheat, taxation, eminent domain, and the claims of others. We refer to these rights as a bundle because, like a bundle of hay or a bundle of sticks, like the diagram here, the bundle can be broken up. In other words, I could have some of the bundle and you could have some of the bundle and somebody else could have some of the bundle. And when we get to estates, which is coming up, the question as to what kind of an estate do you have really is asking the question, well, how big is your bundle? All right, do you have the whole bundle? Do you only have part of the bundle? Do you only have some of the bundle? I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm renting a studio apartment. Do I have an estate in land? I'm renting a studio apartment. Do I have an estate in land? Well, let's see. Do I have the right to possess it? That's what I pay the rent for, to use it. Now, I can't sell it, but I can enter it I could give it away if the lease didn't prevent me. I could sublet it if the lease didn't prevent me. I can't really borrow against it. Can I exclude others? Could I have the owner of the property arrested for trespassing if I found out that every day I went to work, he came into my apartment and sat on my couch and watched the Nature Channel on my big screen TV? And the answer is yes, I could have him arrested for trespassing. So it seems like I own something. Now, I don't have the whole bundle, but I have enough of the bundle to have an estate and land. The owner, as it says here, can dispose of the whole bundle or any of these rights, and holding these rights to the exclusion of others defines ownership. And we're going to look at some examples where people can't exclude others, and therefore their ownership rights are changed. So when we're talking about property, there's only two kinds of property. There's real property, and then there's personal property. There is no third kind. So real property, the one word definition of real property is it is immovable. And by immovable, we mean immovable by law. And personal property is something that is movable. Now, there are three things that constitute real property. Number one is the land. Number two are things attached to the land. And number three are things that pertain to the land and can't be separated from it. Personal property, there will be questions on the state exam about personal property, not as many as real property because it's a real estate exam. And the Department of Real Estate wants you to know, among most importantly, that the word personal property also means chattel. Let me say it the other way around. The word chattel means personal property. How about that? So the word chattel is an old English word. And yes, the word cattle and the word chattel are related because cows were one of the most valuable things that the peasants could own. So the word chattel means personal property. The word chose, and it's actually pronounced shows, is another word that you might see on the state exam. That's another old English word, and it refers to a right in action, like to be able to sue somebody. And that right is a personal property right. How many of you have ever heard the word realty? Right? We all know what that means. It means real property. Well, there's another word like it, personalty, that means personal property. So if you say to somebody, you've got nice personalty, that doesn't necessarily mean they have a good attitude. It means they have nice stuff. It is generally movable. Mortgages, trust deeds, stock and real estate syndicates are personal property interests. A leasehold interest in real estate is personal property, and personal property can be alienated. Now, the word alienated sort of means sold, right? The word alienated means that you have conveyed it. It can be hypothecated, which is two Greek words, hypo, which means underneath, like, hypodermic, and thecate, which means to pledge or to put something up. It means to mortgage. How about that? Right? And it can sometimes become real property. So there's a question on the state exam that essentially asks, why can personal property be a problem for real estate agents? And the answer is because we don't necessarily know who owned it. It could be alienated. For example, if I have a building and in the building I have some property, does that mean I own it? Is it possible that I have conveyed it to somebody else? Is it possible I have borrowed money against it? And whether or not it's attached and how it is attached might change it from real property to personal property or back and forth. We're going to go through examples of that. If we were going to sell personal property, we would use a bill of sale. We spend a lot more time of that in another class when we're talking about business opportunities, which is personal property. And you can't search public records like real property to see who owns stuff. So this is a chart that explains some of the differences between real and personal property. And one of them is that an agreement in real property ordinarily has to be in writing. Personal property, it has to be in writing only if it exceeds $500. That's a relatively common question on the state exam. If we were going to sell real property, we would give the buyer a grant deed. If we were going to sell personal property, they would get a bill of sale. If we were going to borrow money against real property, we would use a mortgage or a trust deed. But if it's personal property, the document is called a security agreement. The real property, because it's located someplace, it's controlled by the state. But commercial property oftentimes are subject to federal as well as other state laws because of the transfer of commerce between states. There is a recording system for real property, but not a recording system for personal property. So if there's a particular parcel of land, I can find out who owns it. And if anybody is having problems downloading the handout on the side, you might want to see, I think I've also pasted in a direct link to the document. You might want to, in order to take notes, you have to download it and use one of the programs. But I can't solve that problem if you don't have it. But you can see I've also pasted in the chat box and I'll do it again, a direct link to the document that I'm using, which you can download. Right. Also, if you look at the email that you were sent that invited you to the class, it typically has a direct link to the handout as well. All right, real property, immovable by law. It includes three things: land, things that are attached to the land, and things that pertain to the land. A bearing wall, this is just a common question, not a difficult one on the state exam, but a bearing wall is a wall that bears the weight of a building, and it's real property. But real property does not include leases, right? Leases are not included, and when we get to leasehold estates, I'll talk more about it. So let's start with land. Well, that seems like a simple topic. Dirt, right? It's dirt. Dirt is real property, but the legal concept of land goes a little bit beyond that. It includes the dirt, the rocks, the minerals, and the stuff that's in the ground. Minerals that are in the ground are real property. When they're mined and taken out, they become personal property. If you sell real property, the mineral rights are automatically transferred unless you retain them, and land can be divided vertically or horizontally. What that means is, let's say there's a parcel of land. If I split it into two halves, that's a vertical subdivision because each half includes what's above it and what's below it. But I also could sell the air rights to one person, the surface rights to another person, and the subsurface rights to somebody else. That would be a horizontal division of the land. The legal concept of land. Now we're getting into things a little more bizarre. Under the legal concept of land, it's not just the dirt that you own, but you own everything above it. This comes from English common law, and it's like an inverted pyramid. If you own the land, you own everything below the land down to the center of the core of the earth. And under English common law, you owned everything above the land. And English common law said to the edges of the universe, right? They were like that. They went around the world putting their flags on stuff. But anyhow, that's been modified a little bit. You still own the land and what's below it, but you don't own to the edges of the universe. It's not going, you can't tell NASA and others, don't fly your satellites over my land without paying me. It doesn't go that high. But you need to know that the legal concept is it's the space beneath the surface and the airspace above it. The right to lateral and subjacent support is coming up. You may have water rights, which are sometimes hard to determine because it isn't in your deed, it isn't in title insurance, it's not in the county records. And of course, all of these rights are not absolute. One way to look at this is land is the inverted pyramid, right? The surface, what's below it, and what's above it. Real estate includes not just the land, but it includes the improvements that have been added to the land, like a house. And when we're talking about real property, we're referring not just to the land and to the improvements, but to the bundle of rights that go with the improvements and the land. Remember, property refers to the bundle of rights. Lateral and subjacent support. This is an example, right? We have A and B and C. A and B are neighbors, but C owns the surface to that right side. What lateral means to the side. So what lateral support means is that A is not allowed to dig a trench if it caused B and C's land to slide towards A. You have the right to be supported on the side. Neither is B allowed to dig a big hole in B's part if it causes C's part to collapse. So if you own land, people are not supposed to chisel away at the sides, nor are they supposed to tunnel underneath and make your land collapse. Riparian, water in a river. Is it real property or is it personal property? Let's say in this diagram, I'm A, and there's a river. Is the water real property or personal property? Now, some people say, well, real property, yeah, but the water moves, right? And remember, real property is immovable. People say personal property. Well, is it my property only when it's next to my land, or do I still own it when it goes downstream? I don't know. And I'll admit that it was a trick question. It was a trick question. The real question is water property? Or is water more like the air or the wild animals, a migratory, a fugitive substance, something that moves around? There's a difference between water rights and water. There's a difference between fishing rights and fish, right? They're not the same thing. So water rights are real property, but the water is not. So riparian comes from a Latin word that we get ripa, which means river. And it's the right of the landowner to reasonable and appropriate use of the water from a stream, river, brook, or water course. Now, littoral is a word that we use to refer to something that is got a tidal action. It's the reasonable and appropriate use of water from a lake, ocean, or sea. So riparian means the water is flowing next to your land. Littoral means there's a time, and how much you own depends on whether or not the water is flowing or whether or not it's tidal. That's coming up. Appropriation is when the state gives a non-riparian owner the right. Surface waters, what if there's a flood? And potable means suitable for drinking. Let's look at my obviously sophisticated diagram, water rights. So we have A and B, and down to that's supposed to be a beach at the bottom where it says ocean. So there's a river that flows through the middle, or roughly the middle, of A's land. Does A have, let's start with this. Does A have a right to take water out of the river? The answer is yes. Does A have a right to take all of the water out of the river? The answer is no. Who decides how much water A can take? And the answer is the California, there's a California State Board of Water Rights, right? And the Water Resources Board, the word was coming to me, the Water Resources Board. So they get to decide how much. So if I'm A how far do I own? Do I own to where the water is? Do I own to where the high water mark is? Do I own to the middle of the stream? Right? High water, water, or middle of the stream? And the answer is you own to where the water is. You don't own to the middle of the stream. Why not? Well, there would be mischief. Supposing that was the Mississippi River, and I bought land on both sides of the Mississippi River, and I own now to the middle of the river, I could build like a big floating toll booth and make people pay me as they went up and down the river. You realize if that were possible, there would be a lot of toll booths on the Mississippi River. So because the river is being used in commercial navigation, people do not own to the middle of the stream, they only own down to where the water is. Now, if there's a flood, and this is a very common question on the state exam, what can A do about the fact that this floods every year? And the answer, as I put to the side, is that you can build a dike against the overflowing river, even if that means more water is going to go downstream and affect other people. But you can't divert the river. You can build a dike, but you can't divert. Now that we get down to where the ocean is, do we own down to the water? I mean, if it was a river, we would own to the water, but if it's a tidal action like an ocean, we don't own down to the water, we own to the mean high tide mark. This again is an old English rule. Ships were made of wood. Sometimes they would capsize and wash up on the shore. And so the King of England had decreed that anything between the high tide mark and the water belonged to the sovereign. If it was a dead whale, it belonged to the sovereign. If it was a boat with good things on it, it belonged to the sovereign. We still have that rule in California, but instead of the sovereign, it's the state of California. That's why in California, it's very difficult to have a private beach. Now, if I own land next to a beach, I can try to prevent people from walking across my land to get to the beach. But if they can get to the beach without walking on my land, there's not much I can do about it because I don't own the beach, right? If they were to swim there, surf there, sail there, I can't do much about it because I don't own the beach. The state of California owns the beach. Now, this California State Water Resources Code says that water that is in a flowing river belongs to the people of the state of California. That's what it says. So now we have the neighbor B. The neighbor B would like to have some of the water that's in that river. Does B have a right to the water in the river? Well, who does the water belong to? It belongs to the people of the state of California. Can B say, well, I'm people and I'm in the state of California and I want some of that water too? The answer is yes, but the problem is A's going to say, well, yeah, the water belongs to the people. I understand that. It's not all my water, but the land between you and the river is my land and you can't come on my land. Right? Your cows can't come on my land to drink water. In the West, and this might happen again, wars were literally fought. People shot at each other over this very issue. And so people that are non-riparian, right, that means they do not own the land adjacent to the flowing river, they're non-riparian, have a right to the water. But they have to ask the state of California, the State Water Resources Board, to go get it for them. And those people that are using water that they're not adjacent to are called appropriators. They're oftentimes called other things, but they're called appropriators. Now, there's a lake on B's land. B can own the lake, right? The reason that A can't own the river is that river flows across boundary lines. But if the lake is contained without a river going in and a river going out, it's possible to own the lake. You can own a lake, but you can't own a river. The water table right, is where water is found, because water generally in the ground is in horizontal layers in geologic areas that are horizontal. And therefore it looks like a table, sort of, like the tabletop. Land is deeded to the mean high tide and tidal areas. Underground waters not in a defined channel are called percolating. Just like a coffee maker is called a percolating machine, right? Because the hot water goes through the ground, right? And that makes, coffee. The original juicing, by the way, the original juicing. And so water that is going through the ground is said to percolate. The Department of Real Estate likes to ask the question about when is a flood hazard frequent? And that's if it happens more than once in a 10-year period, 2 or more times in 10 years. By the way, before you dam, divert, or do anything, you have to have permission from the local flood control district. In my area, there was a guy that just decided he was going to build a dam, right? Because he wanted to, and it was on his land. And the city, the county said, stop, don't do it, you can't do it. And he did it anyhow. They arrested him, dragged him away, right? Because it affects people below and people above, and you just can't do it. So we're going through the 3 things that are real property. Number 1 is land. Land is the surface of the earth and everything below it and everything above it, like an inverted pyramid. Number 2 are things that are affixed to the land, and they're called fixtures. And we have come to something that real estate agents actually need to know about. Now, from that comment, you might be thinking, gee, Mike, is everything you've said so far stuff we really don't need to know about as a real estate agent? And the answer is maybe, yeah, maybe you could live, but this is something that you're going to need to know about as a real estate agent. Long time ago, when I first got into real estate, I sold a house. The buyer, I represented the buyer and the seller. The seller was moving to Texas and buying a new home. Buyer moves in, calls me up and says, hey, there's no hot water in this house. And I said, well, it takes time. Maybe we, didn't switch on the utilities. And they said, no, we switched the utilities. We've looked. There's no hot water heater in this house. I'm like, really? So I called the guy in Texas and I said, hey, how's it going? How was the move? How do you like your new house? Wonderful. That sounds great. Oh, by the way, the hot water heater. You didn't, take that with you, did you? And the guy said, well, yeah, this was a new home and they were going to charge us for one. And the other one we bought just 6 months ago, from Home Depot, was in good shape. So we took it with us. Now, guess who bought the buyer a hot water heater? Anybody want to take a wild shot at that? Who bought the buyer a hot water heater? I did. See, I believe if you parked outside of Home Depot, Lowe's, and what you're looking for are people coming out of Home Depot and Lowe's in business casual attire, and they're bringing out chandeliers, fireplace screens, patio furniture, and blinds and things like that, and you stop them and you ask them, what do you do for a living? You're going to find that real estate agent comes up higher than our percentage of the population. So why is this going on? It's because the agent sold a house and the buyer moved in and stuff's gone. And the seller is thinking, well, this is my stuff, it's not your stuff. And the buyer's like, no, that's part of the house. That's called fixtures. Now, in order for something to be affixed, it doesn't have to be manually attached. It could be embedded. It could be roots. It could be permanently resting. Some things are so heavy, you don't have to bolt them down to have them stay put. So a fixture is items that are of personal property that are attached physically or legally and are considered real property. And examples on the state exam have been fireplace screens and other kinds of screens and wall beds and wall-to-wall carpeting and Venetian blinds, and there's a much bigger. I'll tell you, mirrors in a bathroom. A mirror in a bathroom. How is the mirror, the one above the sink? Is it bolted to the wall? Could there be like a hook and it's hooked to the wall? Is that real property? You understand? This is a debatable thing. A phrase the Department of Real Estate likes to use is that fixtures are incorporated into the land and are considered to be real property. There are 5 tests of a fixture. We use the memory gimmick Maria, the name, as a way to remember the 5 tests. Now, what's curious about this is that Maria, although maybe easier to remember, is in the reverse order of importance. The real order would be Aram, but I don't know if that means anything. It doesn't to me. So we're stuck with Maria. The first test of a fixture is the method of attachment. How something is attached would give us a clue as to whether or not the person attaching it wanted it to stay put or not. Adaptability of the item means that if something was custom built for a property, it is likely to be considered real property because of the intention to leave it there. Relationship means between the buyer and the seller. Courts are generally on the buyer's side because the buyer buys what the buyer sees. And the seller should have said, you don't get the chandelier. Intention is the second to the most important test. And agreement is the most important test. So for example, even in my water heater example, would it have been possible for the seller to have said, hey, I want to keep the water heater? Right? It's not included in the sale. And the buyer says, oh, okay, that's fine. Right? I agree to that. Right? Then it would be simple, right? It's the property of the seller and he could take it. I sold a house one time. The seller wanted to keep and take with him a toilet. It was a special toilet that he had. Right? I'm not saying it was custom made, but it was, let's just say, a better than average one. And he had me put into the contract that you don't get the toilet, right? That toilet is going with me when I move. Whatever they agree to, that's fine. Now let's go through this test again and see, because this sounds, I think, kind of straightforward. Let's see. Method of attachment versus intention. There's a house, a Victorian house, that has been jacked up off the foundation. It's on blocks up off the foundation. Is that house off the foundation real property or is it personal property? Up off the foundation. The answer is it depends on why we jacked the house up. If we jacked the house up simply because we needed to do that to fix the foundation, and we had no intention of moving the house, it's still real property. But if, let's say there's a vacant lot down the street and I don't like Victorians, but the guy down the street does, and he wants the old Victorian, so we jacked it up so he could bring one of those special trucks and move the house down the street, now it's personal property. It's off the foundation, but our intention is to move. Is it possible that I could have sold the old Victorian to the guy down the street prior to jacking it up off the foundation? Why not? That house that's still on the foundation, is it real property? Or after I've sold it, is it now the personal property of someone else? And the answer is it's the personal property of someone else. What that means is a house on the foundation can be personal property, and a house off its foundation can be real property, because agreement and intention is more important than the method of attachment. Adaptability. There's a guy in Marin County who had a property located next to the water, and he had a boat dock. And the way the boat dock worked is that there were 4 poles sticking out of the water. And his boat dock was a bunch of boards connected together with 4 iron rings that were spaced apart so that you could lift it up, put it over the poles, and put it down on the water. And if the water went up and down, it would go up and down. He sells his property. The buyer comes in and the boat dock is missing. The poles are there, but the part that floated up and down is gone. Real property or personal property? The court ruled it was real property because that boat dock had been custom built to be used on that land. If you've ever driven through farmland, and you see those sprinklers that roll around, right, sprinkling, real property or personal property? The answer is usually they're real property. If the sprinkler was in the ground, if the pipes were in the ground, you wouldn't probably argue that's real property. But the fact that they roll around, but they were made in order to roll around on that farm, they're still real property because the use of the property is more important than the method of attachment. Relationship, we talked about that. Intention, a woman in California sold her house, single family home. She had had a pipe organ built into one of the walls in her house. A lot of fun on Halloween, I bet, right? So you can sit there and, play your pipe organ. So the buyer buys the house, right? The contract doesn't say anything about the pipe organ. Buyer moves in, pipe organ is gone. The woman had taken it out, refinished the wall, repaint. You couldn't tell that it was there or not. Buyer sues the seller, saying, "Where's my pipe organ?" The pipe organ that was built into the wall, real property or personal property? The court ruled it was personal property. Why? Because it's a musical instrument. If it had been a baby grand piano, you wouldn't have expected to get it. The fact that it was a type of musical instrument that needed to be attached to the wall did not change the fact that it was a musical instrument, an item of personal use and enjoyment. But the court opined that if this had been a church, the pipe organ might have been considered real property, because a pipe organ in a church is something that would be used for the intention of the property. But a pipe organ in a single family house in a neighborhood is just a nuisance, but not something normally designed for the property. Can you start to get the idea why writing it down in a purchase contract is a good thing to do? I sold a property one time and I'm good at, picking out these things, but in the garden was a concrete bench. Buyer comes, the bench is gone. I looked at the list. Garden furniture was not on the list, right? The buyer's like, "Where's the bench? I wouldn't have bought the house if there wasn't a bench in the backyard." You get the idea. Writing anything that's even a gray area, you put it in the contract, because agreement is more important than the way it was attached or really just about anything else. The Department of Real Estate also likes to ask, what is not a test? Size, cost, time of attachment, not test. You're going to be asked on your state exam questions about this. You're going to need to know, Maria, apples on an apple tree, are they real property or are they personal property? Apples on an apple tree. Well, let's see. The apple, there's the stem and the stem and the branch and the branch and the trunk and the trunk and the roots are in the ground. I mean, if I buy land, don't I get what's growing on it? So as a general rule, trees, the things that are on trees are part of the real property. Is it possible that the farmer sold the apples before harvest? But you have, why not, right? Line up a buyer before you've even picked them. Are those apples still real property apples? Or if the farmer has sold them, are they now the personal property of someone else? And the personal property of somebody else, those apples are now personal property. Could a farmer have borrowed money against the apples? before the harvest. I think that's what farmers have to borrow against the next harvest. Are they still real property apples, or have the apples become movable by law because a security interest has been created, giving the lender the right to come and take the apples if they're not paid? They're personal property apples. If the apple orchard was planted or cultivated or tended by a tenant farmer, our law says that apples are personal property of the tenant. And this has been on the state exam. The tenant has a right to come in even after the lease is expired to get the last harvest. Can you tell by looking at the apple whether or not it's a real property apple or a personal property apple? You can't tell. They all look the same, but it's real property unless sold, borrowed against, or cultivated by a tenant farmer. And this is called emblements. Emblements, which are crops, annual, industrial, or cultivated, are considered real property between a buyer and the seller, but they are personal property between a landlord and tenant. When cut, mortgaged, or sold, they become personal property. Between a landlord and fixture and tenant, fixtures are presumed to belong to the landlord, and between a lender and a borrower, they're considered part of the real property. In a dispute, courts tend to favor the buyer because the buyer buys what the buyer sees. There's a term that appears on the state exam. It's called constructive severance. The word constructive means not really, not necessarily, but we're going to act as if. So constructive means, constructive severance means maybe you haven't actually severed the apple, but we're going to act as if the apple has been picked. So constructive severance means that you're converting real property to personal property if it is not physically removed from the real property, but the intent is to remove it. It has been constructively picked or severed. Trade fixtures are an exception. Trade fixtures are an exception. They're items of personal property that a tenant has attached. Let's say England in the Middle Ages. A carpenter is renting a stall in the market. The lease is up. So it's the last day, the carpenter is there, and the carpenter has a big, and the carpenter is putting in a box all of the tools that the carpenter uses while the carpenter is, carpentering, And the landlord comes over and says, "Hey, what are you doing?" And the carpenter says, "Well, my lease is up. I'm putting all my tools in the box and I'm going to go." And the landlord says, "You can't take those tools. You've used those tools on my land for the last year. Those tools belong to me as the landlord." Now, most people would, I think, agree that doesn't make sense. The carpenter ought to be able to take his tools or her tools when they move to another stall. But right next to the carpenter is another stall, and there's a blacksmith there. Now, the blacksmith's tools are different from the carpenter's tools. The blacksmith has a hearth, the blacksmith has an anvil, things that are kind of built in. Now, if it doesn't make sense to give the landlord the carpenter's tools, then it doesn't make sense to give the landlord the blacksmith's tools, because tools are tools. Now, should the blacksmith have to repair the damages that might be done by removing the tools? The answer is yes. But tools that are used in a business are called trade fixtures that a tenant has attached for a trade or business. They're considered to be the personal property, may usually be removed by the tenant. By the way, if you're taking the real estate exam soon, there are some companies out there that have the wrong answer to a question. And the question is, in a trade fixture, if the tenant is leaving, are trade fixtures always considered to be the real property of the tenant? Now, one of the things I will mention if you're taking the state exam is be reluctant to pick an answer that has the word always in it, because there's another choice in the question that says it depends upon the agreement between the landlord and tenant. What is the most important test as to whether or not something is real or personal property? And the answer is agreement. So even though the California Civil Code says that trade fixtures are the personal property of the tenant, it says that doesn't mean that the landlord and tenant by agreement cannot change their status. Courts have ruled such for a long, long time. But normally trade fixtures are not considered to be real property. Things can be real property, personal property, back and forth. So I have land and there are trees growing, timber growing in the land. Those trees that are growing, real property. I cut down the trees and I stack up a pile of logs, personal property. I take the pile of logs and I build a log cabin, real property. I tear down the log cabin and break everything into smaller pieces, personal property. It can go back and forth. And water heaters, in case you're wondering, are considered to be fixtures and you can't take them with you. So we're talking about the three things that are real property. Number one, land. Land is the surface of the earth, everything below it, everything above it, might include water rights. Number two, fixtures, things that are attached to the land. Remember Maria, but not trade fixtures. But number three are appurtenances. And an appurtenance is something that pertains to the land, is used for its benefit, and is said to run with the land. Well, you might think, well, land doesn't seem to run very much. What's going on? But it means it goes wherever the land goes. It does not need to be mentioned in the deed. You don't need a separate contract. They pass automatically to the new owner. And there's several examples here. Easements we're going to talk about in another class, but stock in a mutual water company. The Department of Real Estate likes this question. I don't know why, but they do. I've actually sold property, by the way, that had stock in a mutual water company, but let's look at an example. So over here, we have a subdivider who's building houses in an area where there is no city water. So what the subdivider does is they drill a well, there's a pumping station, there's a, see, that's a water tower. And there's a water tower, and that pumping water company, that's where you get water. So let's say I buy the house marked with a X. In addition to getting a deed to the property, I'm also going to get stock in a mutual water company. And that stock gives me access to the water. Could I sell my house to a, let's say, brother-in-law I don't like, but not the stock in the water company? Can I do that? Could I sell him the house and then afterwards say, oh, you wanted water too? You should have said something, because I didn't sell that. I just sold you the house. See, I can't do that because the stock in the mutual water company is an appurtenance. Remember the three things that are real property: land, fixtures, and appurtenances. And as an appurtenance, it is immovable by law. And it is, for purposes of the state exam, always real property. If you're taking the state exam and there's a question, which of the following is real property, and stock in a mutual water company is a choice, just pick it. I don't care how good the other answers are, unless there's an all of the above, but there's something wrong with them. It's always real property. All right. So now we've, discussed what is property, what is real property, and all that. The next question is, how do we describe it? Because in order to sell something or lease something or borrow money against something, we have to be able to describe it. And that would bring up legal or good descriptions. And this would be important, especially if somebody owns several properties. The legal methods of describing land are meets and bounds, the recorded map, or the US government survey, a street address, is not a legal description. Really? I go on a listing appointment. The seller says, yes, I want to sell my house. I want you to list it. Where do I sign? So I pull up the residential listing agreement, and in the contract, there's a place that it says property, address. And in that spot, I write 233 Greenwood Drive, San Jose, California. Is that good enough for a listing agreement, a street address? The answer is yes. Most listing contracts have a street address. All right. So now that I've listed a property, somebody wants to buy it. And so I get an offer to buy the property, and the offer where it says address of the property, it says 233 Greenwood Drive, San Jose, California. Is that good enough for a purchase agreement? And the answer is yes. Most purchase agreements simply have a street address. So now that the contract is, closing, I deed the property to the buyer, and on the grant deed where it says address, I write in 233 Greenwood Drive, San Jose, California. Is that good enough for a grant deed? And the answer is yes. Well, wait a second. It doesn't seem like a street address is a illegal description, right? I mean, I can use it in legal contracts and deeds and things like that. And the answer is yes, it's true. You can use it for all those things, but it is still not a legal description. Why not? And the answer is because it is not one of those three. Those are the only legal descriptions. And the first one we're going to start with is the old one. Well, their meets and bounds is actually older, but anyhow. And it's called the United States Government Survey System. Who was the greatest real estate broker in America of all time? What individual brokered the sale of more real estate or purchase of more real estate than any other broker ever? And the answer is, well, it's Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson. Why Thomas Jefferson? Because Thomas Jefferson brokered, I don't know if he got a commission, the Louisiana Purchase, where the United States purchased from France pretty much everything, west of the Mississippi. Now, there were already people living there who didn't know about this, but, they were going to explain it to them later. So now there's all this land that belongs to the United States. Well, in order for people to sell it, to buy it, to rent it, to do stuff with it, you have to describe it. So this is a system that was designed to quickly describe land throughout the United States. And it's used in 30 of the 50 states. And it uses something called base and meridian lines. And north and south lines are called meridians. And they are imaginary lines. And then there are east and west lines that are called baselines. These are imaginary lines. I'll give you an example in a second. So using the base and meridian lines as a starting point, you can find a piece of land. There are 3 base and meridian systems in California: Humboldt up north, Mount Diablo, still kind of north, and San Bernardino in the south. And that's how they are abbreviated. I used to teach these classes up in the Walnut Creek area, which is near Mount Diablo. And this is going back to the imaginary part. And I had some students who had gone up to Mount Diablo to look for the lines. And they came back and they said, we were up there at Mount Diablo and we didn't see any lines. Well, they're not chalked in the ground like at a baseball game or a football game or a soccer, and they're imaginary lines. Now, California, this is a colorful map. So does every place in the United States use the system? No. 30 out of the 50 states do, not the original 13 colonies and not Texas. Right? Doesn't use the system. California uses the system, and California has 3 base and meridian systems: San Bernardino, Mount Diablo, and Humboldt. Why does California have 3? Why not one? And the question is it because California is so wide, or is it because California is so long? Is it wide, or is it long? And the answer is it's a little bit of both. California is wide. Which city do you think is furthest west? Which city furthest west? Reno or Los Angeles? Which is further west? And the answer is Reno, and it's not really close. There's a big bend in the state, which kind of throws the system off. The other thing is because California is so deep. Let me ask you this question. If I have two lines that are right next to each other, and those lines both run north and south, are they parallel? Two lines next to each other that run north and south, are they parallel? Now, a lot of times people say, well, yeah, they're right next to each other, they're parallel. And when people say, yes, they're parallel, I'm always amazed, right? Because you don't see that many members of the Flat Earth Society walking around, right? You understand there's still people that believe that the world is flat. You know, all the pictures you saw were, made up and photoshopped or whatever, and I guess if you go far enough, there's the, drop off or the dragons and all that kind of stuff. But if you subscribe to a more modern view that the world is round, and we have two lines that run north, what happens at the North Pole is that they intersect. And when they run south at the South Pole, they intersect. If they intersect, they are not parallel, right? Not parallel. So what happens with this system is the lines start running together, right? Because the world is round, and as they go up, and so they have to chop up the country into pieces to try and make it work a little bit better. Just saying. Now, description. In the township system, we begin with baselines, horizontal, meridians that are vertical. The Department of Real Estate wants you to know that meridians run north and south and baselines run east and west. One way to remember that is meridian ends in N for north and south, and base ends in E for east and west. And then there are ranges and townships. Moving along the baseline east and west of the meridian, every 6 mile, a north-south line is drawn. These lines are called ranges, and they are numbered as they lie east or west of the principal meridian. It establishes a grid of vertical lines, ranges, and horizontal lines, townships. The lines are 6 miles apart. Moving north and south, every 6 mile, those surveyors drew an east-west line, which is called the township line. Is HPM, Humboldt Basin Meridian, and Mount Diablo Basin Meridian, and San Bernardino Basin Meridian, for those are the three, I didn't say P, but it's a B for baselines. So it's the Humboldt Basin Meridian. It is the Humboldt Basin Meridian, Mount Diablo Basin Meridian, and San Bernardino Basin Meridian. All right. Okay. Okay. So there's an east-west line. The strips of land running east and west are called tiers. It forms squares. The squares are 6 miles on the side. They're called townships, and they are numbered as they lie north and south of the baseline. And the township is the square created by the intersections. And so this is a diagram, and it shows there's the meridian. Every 6 miles, there's a north-south line called a range line. There's the baseline. Every 6 miles, there's an east-west line called a township line. And where they intersect, they create a square, and the square is called a township. Now, this is not going to come up every day after you get your real estate license. I just want you to know, right? As a real estate agent, days are going to go by and you won't need to worry about the base and meridian system. Weeks, no questions about base and meridian. Months, no one's going to have a year. All right, no one's ever going to ask you about base and meridian systems, probably again. And I've actually had people, when they took the state exam, they were upset because the Department of Real Estate didn't ask them any questions about the system. And they knew that if the Department of Real Estate never asked them a question about the system, they would never be able to use the system ever again, right? Because this is it, right? Only the Department of Real Estate. So I thought, as a way of maybe making this better, is that I'm going to give you a way of using this system in a practical manner, right? Does that sound like a good idea? And what we're going to assume is that when you pass the real estate exam, you're going to throw a great big party, right? You're going to throw a great big party. And of course, you're going to invite all of us who have suffered with you to go to your party. And you're going to use the United States government survey system to tell people where the party is. That way, if the invitations fall in the wrong hands, right, no one's going to be able to find it, because you got to go to real estate school in order to know, how to use the system. So what would be the first thing you would need to tell people if you were using the system on your party invitation? And the answer is, which of the 3 systems are you in? Let's say Mount Diablo. Why not? So this description would go right to left. And on the far right side, we would put in MDBN, Mount Diablo Base and Meridian System. Now, as you can see, that's a really big system, right? It's that whole green area of California is the Mount Diablo Base and Meridian System. So we're going to have to tell people a little bit more than that. Now, what we're going to tell them, and I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but what we're going to have to tell them is which range, right? Remember the ranges? Which range our party is going to be in. Let's say that our party is going to be in range 2 east of the Base and Meridian system. Right? That's where our party is going to be, range 2 east. Well, the problem with that is that that range is 6 miles long, 6 miles wide. And how long could it be? Well, it could be really long. I mean, again, if you look at the diagram of California, right? If you look at the diagram of California, there are ranges that run from pretty much south all the way to the Oregon border. So if we told people that what range we're in, that's not going to be good enough, because it's just too wide and it just goes on too long. So the second thing we're going to have to tell them is which township we're in. So we're in, let's say our party is going to be in Township 2 South of Range 2 East of the Mount Diablo Base Meridian system. This is where the party is. You see, we first have to tell people what range we're in. Then we have to tell people within that range which of the townships we're in. This is something to think about. Ranges, range lines run north and south, but ranges are numbered east and west. Township lines run east and west, but townships are numbered north and south. So we're going to tell people we're in the 2nd township south of the baseline, in the 2nd range east of the meridian. Is everybody with me? That is going to bring up a big parcel of land. And that's called a township. And the township is 6 miles by 6 miles by 6 miles by 6 miles. There's no way anybody will find our party in that township. It's just too big, right? Townships are 6 miles square. So what we're going to have to do is tell people within that township which section we're in. Sections, by the way, each contain 640 acres. And the yellow, all of the different colors are different townships. Notice how the yellow is one full township, and it starts with section 1 in the top right. And then notice the numbering system. It weaves back and forth in a serpentine snake-like fashion until it gets all the way to 36. Why did they number it that way? The answer is because when they were surveying, remember Thomas Jefferson, this was a long time ago, when they were surveying, the surveyors walked, rode horses or mules. Now, if you were a surveyor and you just rode a mule 6 miles laying out the land, where do you want to put number 7? Do you want to go trotting back to where you started, or do you want to put it right next to number 6? Well, right next to number 6. So that's how the system, you would walk it. So that's how they laid it out. The Department of Real Estate, diabolically, they have a question on the state exam. Which section is due east of section 36? It's a question that's been on the state exam. Well, if you, by the way, when you take the state exam, they give you a marker board and a pen, you can draw a box, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, and what you're gonna find after you've done that is that 31 is right next to 36, because whatever is at the end of that row, right, would be next to it, right? You see that, right? They, who knows why they do it, but they do stuff like that. So the sections that are, the sections are in townships. They're 6 miles square and they have 36 squares called sections, right? And I've gone through the numbering and all of that. Each section is 1 mile square and 1 square mile. Each section is 640 acres. All right, so back to our party invitation. We've told everybody that the party is going to be in Township 2 south of Range 2 east of the Mount Diablo Basin Meridian System. But that township is a 6 mile square and it contains 36 square miles. That's too much. We're going to have to tell people which section in the township the party is being held. Let's say the party is in section 2. So the way that our address for the party would read now, section 2 of Township 2 south of Range 2 east, Mount Diablo Basin Meridian System, right? This, by the way, better be a good party. So at that point, we've identified the section of land the party is going to be in and how big. This is a really common question on the state exam. How many acres are in a section? And the answer is 640. 640, it's too big. No one will find the party if they have to wander around 640 acres. Maybe we should tell people which half of this section our party is going to be in. Let's say our party is going to be in the south half of section 2. So if there's 640 acres in the section, that would mean 320 acres are in the south half. 320, that's still a lot. That's still kind of big. People will be wandering around. Maybe we should tell people which half of the, we're in the south half, but maybe we should tell people which half of the south half we're in. We're in the east half of the south half of section 2. Couldn't we just call that the southeast quarter of section 2? So if there's 600 in a total and 320 and a half, then there would be 160 acres in that quarter of a section, 160 acres. Wow, that's still kind of big. right? 160 acres, people will still have trouble finding the party. So maybe we should tell people which half of the southeast quarter we're in. We're in the party will be in the north half of the southeast quarter. All right, so there's 600 acres in the total, 320 and a half, 160 and a quarter. So if we're in the north half of the southeast quarter, that would be 80 acres. Still pretty big, hard to find a party. Maybe we should tell people, right, we've already told them we're in the north half of the southeast quarter. Maybe we should tell people which half of the north. We're in the west of the north half of the southwest quarter. So this is where the party is going to be. The north half of the west half of the south. Could we just call that the northwest quarter of the southeast quarter? How about that? Isn't that what that is? The northwest quarter of the southeast quarter, and that would have 40 acres. 40 acres. That's an interesting number. If you've watched movies about farming and ranching and old westerns, right? Farmers are talking about the north 40, the south 40, the front 40, the back 40, right? Well, what are they talking? Why 40? And the answer is because it's a quarter section. And because this is the way the land was originally described, that's the way land had a tendency to be sold. If you fly over the United States in an airplane and you look out the window, the United States looks like a big checkerboard. If you fly over Europe, if you fly over Asia and you look out the window, it doesn't look like that. It's more of a patchwork quilt with irregularly shaped parcels. Why does the United States look like a big checkerboard? And the answer is because that's the way that they described the land in the first place. So that's the way the land was sold. So this is how we would write our cocktail invitation. Right? I'm sure you guys are all writing this down. It's going to be the northwest quarter, the southeast quarter of Section 2, Township 2 South, of Range 2 East, of the Mount Diablo Basin Meridian System. Now, we're gonna not go any further than 40 acres, but just say, we're gonna stop there. Now, the facts you should know, these have all been questions on the state exam. Townships are numbered north and south of the baseline. Some are not standard, really. Not all townships contain 36 sections. Why not? Well, remember the lines start to run together. Also, what happens when they hit a city or the ocean or what, they stop. You need to know that meridian lines run north and south and baselines run east and west. Ranges are north and south and are 6 mile wide. Township lines are east and west. A standard township is 36 sections, 6 miles square, and contains 36 square miles. Now, the Department of Real Estate does not ask math questions anymore, but they've had a question about a 24-mile square. And the question was, how many townships is it? The answer is 16. They had a question about a 36-mile square. And the question is, how many townships? And the answer is 36. A section, as I mentioned, is 1 mile square and contains 640 acres. You need to know for the state exam that an acre is 43,560 square feet. We know of a test that the Department of Real Estate uses where they ask the same question twice. Because they're not, smooth at some of this stuff. How big is an acre? 43,560. A mile is 5,280 lineal feet. A half mile is, well, half of that. A square, they've asked about a square acre, what would be the dimensions? It's 209 by 209. And for some reason, the Department of Real Estate has been more recently asking, how long is a chain? There used to be a system of describing land called chains and rods. Literally, you've seen it in a football game where they, stretching the chains to measure. I mean, that's a chain. Right. But a chain for these measurement purposes is 66 feet and a rod is 16 and a half feet. All right, so let's say we've described the northwest border of the southeast border of section 2. That's 40 acres. That's a pretty big parcel of land. I'd like to subdivide, but I don't want 40 acres, right? You see, I only need 4 acres or 10 acres or something like that. I don't want 40 acres. Well, how do I buy 10 acres from a 40-acre parcel if the US government survey system doesn't go past a quarter section? How do we do it? And the answer is meets and bounds. Meets and bounds. We ever watched pretty much any pirate movie, right? Any pirate movie, there's always a map, right? Every pirate movie, right? Don't they have a map? And you know what the map always says is something like you go on a certain day of the year, you know, to the island and you find the 2 palm trees that are crossed, right? You know, and you stand there and at a particular time, there's a little line that appears, you know, because of the shadow, and you walk so many paces, right? And then you turn and you walk so many paces and then you turn, right? That's meets and bounds. Meets means measurements. Bounds means direction, like the northbound bus. Now, that is what was used in the original 13 colonies in Texas. It is a terrible system, right? It's a very difficult system. But anyhow, it's what they use, and it uses a point of beginning, and you describe it as you go around. So meets are measures, and bounds, which is a monument or boundaries, or we're heading towards this, right? Notice it says that monuments can be destroyed. Do you think we've ever had deeds in California that said something like this? The property begins at Hangman's Rock. It goes due east till you hit the grove of sycamore trees, then south to the old mill, then back to, or west, let's say, to Snake Creek, and then following the creek back to Hangman's Rock, right? There's deeds like that. Now, the problem is today is the rock is gone, right? It was carted off a long time ago in the quarry. The sycamore trees were cut down a long time ago. The old mill is gone, and they built a dam, and there is no creek. So what do, right? You need one of those spots in order to get going, in order for this to work. Monuments can be lost or destroyed. Now, this is just an example of how it would work. So let's say up here is the big 40-acre parcel, and I only want to buy a part of it. So the description would say something like, at the northwest intersection of Hampton and Thompson Roads, 200 feet west, 175 feet. Notice that's not due north, but north off a little bit, following Buckskin Creek to where it hits Hampton Road back to the intersection. That's how you would describe it. So we start, the big parcels are described using US government survey. Then we break up those 40-acre pieces using meets and bounds. This description here appears on the state exam. It came from a reference book the Department of Real Estate put out like 12 years ago. And on the state exam, what they do is they give you this description, and I mean this description. O Street, 200 feet, western, southwest corner, they give you this description. And then the Department of Real Estate says in their question, what is this? And the answer is, it's a meets and bounds description. It's just an example. Now, remember that one didn't go due north, it was at an angle. I haven't been seeing a lot of angle questions on the state exam recently, but you know, there are 360 degrees in a circle, 60 minutes in degrees, and 60 seconds in a minute. I'll bet you knew the last one, 60 seconds in a minute. So we can say that it's, the bearing is off a little bit. So for example, 45 degrees east of north, it would be north 45 degrees east. That's an example. All right, so now we've described, we started with a quarter section, 40 acres. We've then grab, let's say, 4 acres out of it using meets and bounds, I'm ready to start subdividing. And that brings up the third system, which is called the lot, block, and tract system, or the recorded map system. And subdivisions are mapped or plotted. And when the map is recorded, you can locate parcels. So the Department of Real Estate isn't going to make you write one or fill, but this is what a map would look like. So how would this work? Well, let's say that's right there. That's lot number 5. And this is block 25. And this is tract, I don't know if I see the tract, 3591, as recorded in the Book of Maps, page such and such, right? And you could go find that page, find the tract. The tract, of course, is much bigger. You find the block, lot, block, tract. Now, a setback, they won't let you build right to the street. They won't let you build to the back of your lot, and they won't let you build right to the sides. You have to have a setback. So there's a front setback, there's a back setback, there's a side setback. Front footage is the measurement of property on the street line. Square footage is multiplying the width times the length. And contiguous just means they touch at every point. Now, just to show you how annoying the Department of Real Estate is, and by the way, some of the questions they have are far more annoying than this, but they gave, and I should have moved this back to where this is sort of the end of the land description, so I threw it in here just to be annoying. So the Department of Real Estate does stuff like this. And by the way, one of the questions they've been using recently is this times 5. It just goes on and on and on. But they would say something like the south half of the northeast quarter, of the northwest quarter, of the southeast quarter, of section 3, township 5 north, range 3 east, San Bernardino Basin Meridian system contains how many acres? How many acres? Now, you might be thinking, who cares, right? I'm going to pick C, whatever that is, because they're going to give you a calculator, by the way, when you take the state exam. And this, the Department of Real Estate does not count as a math question, but what you do with your calculator is you start by putting in how many acres are in a section. The answer is 640. So we put in 640. Now what we're going to do is we're going to divide by the bottom part of each fraction. So the south half we divide by 2. Of the northeast quarter we divide by 4. Of the northwest quarter we divide by 4. Of the southeast quarter we divide by 4. And on the state exam, they sometimes then have a comma and. Whenever you see the comma in the end, you hit equal, because it's going to tell you the number of acres that are in that first description. They give you a marker board, write down 5. Then it'll go on, and what about the next, and then you keep doing it until you've added them all up. Useful things for real estate agents to know. Okay? All right, we've talked about what is property. We've talked about how to describe land. Now we're going to talk about an estate. And an estate is, an estate is how long something is owned. Right? How long? Ownership rights which could or are possessory. In order for it to be an estate, somebody has to have the right to possess the property. Now, the Department of Real Estate doesn't get into what possession means because it can be a little bit murky. Living there is possession. Farming it sometimes is, sometimes isn't. An estate refers to the degree, quantity, nature, and extent of interest somebody has. There could be more than one on one property. Somebody could have a fee simple and an estate for years, which is a lease. There are 2 kinds of estates, freehold and less than freehold. So freehold estates are ownership estates, and they're divided into 2. There's 2 of them. There's a fee simple and a life estate. Now, the fee simple has 2 estates, 2 types. One is called the fee simple absolute. Not really sure what that means, but I think it has something to do with vodka. Not entirely sure about that. And then the other one is a fee simple defeasible. And defeasible means it's defeatable. Defeatable. Supposing, and this is the most common example on the state exam. On the state exam, there's a question about a man who donates property with a house on it to a church group, but in the deed says that the property cannot be used for the sale of alcoholic beverages. Right? They can have, I don't know, bungo games there, but they can't sell drinks. That creates a defeatable fee. And I'll explain what a fee means in a minute, but it creates a defeatable estate because they could lose it if they are ever caught selling alcohol. If you're wondering, you know, I got a condominium and what do I have? You have a fee simple absolute, right? Virtually most people have fee simple absolutes. A life estate could be a reversion or a remainder. We'll get to that in a minute. And leasehold estates, which are less than freehold, there's the estate for years, an estate from periodic to periodic tenancy, an estate at will, and estate at sufferance. And what separates these is that the freehold estates are ownership estates, and they're indefinite in duration. We don't know when they're going to end. Whereas leases are with a definite time period. They can't go on forever. There's actually rules about how long an agricultural lease or an urban lease can go. So let's start with a freehold. A freehold, it not fixed or specified its duration. It could be called a fee simple estate, a fee estate, an estate in fee, a perpetual estate. The Department of Real Estate is really keen that you know that this is called an estate of inheritance. It is indefinite in duration. So one of the fun things, well, maybe not, about getting a real estate license and going through a course like this is you get to learn about old English stuff. Right? I have a friend that came from England, and he always liked to say, I'm from England, you know where history comes from, you know, that sort of a thing. And so the year was 1066. And in the year 1066, William of Normandy, also known as William the Conqueror, he had some other interesting nicknames, which you can Google search for yourself. He crosses the English Channel with his French knights. William did not speak English. And he was crossing the English Channel with his French knights in order to claim the crown of England because the previous king had just died. William was related, I'm just saying. But the monarchy in England had been taken over by Prince Harold, by King Harold at this point. And so at the Battle of Hastings, William defeats Harold, cuts off his head, and becomes the King of England. Now, up until that point in England, the king owned all real property. If you were a peasant, you could rent land and you could own a cow and you could own clothes, but you couldn't own real property. Only the king could own real property. It was good to be the king. But William had a better idea, he thought. And his idea was he didn't want to own everything because it's hard to tax people when you own all the real estate, right? You could tax them on their money and their cows, but they can hide that kind of stuff. So what William did is he started to give land away, not to the English people. Oh, no, no, no. No, he gave land to the people that came with him, the French guys with their horses and the army, and helped him win the battle. And those people became the fiefs of the king. F-I-E-F. It's a feudal concept. And they had an estate of inheritance. So if you were one of the lords that was given a territory by William, your children could inherit it and their children could inherit it, and everybody on and on and on it would go, right? And although, you know, people have said, well, it's called a fee, did you pay a fee? And the answer is that why it's called a fee, because they had to pay a fee? And the answer is no, that's not why it's called a fee, but they did pay a fee. The word fee here comes from the word fief, F-I-E-F, like you have your own little fiefdom, but they also paid fees. If you're interested in studying how that system worked, it's really easy. Binge watch The Sopranos, right? Just watch The Sopranos, right? Because that's sort of a good idea of how the system works. So in The Sopranos, right, there was the big guys in New York, right? And then the people in New Jersey were supposed to kick up money to New York. And if you were the head guy in New Jersey, then you had these other capos, and they would do their thing, but they would give money to you. And then they had people that worked for them, and they would, you understand, the soldiers would give it to the capos, would give it to the head of the New Jersey, would give it to the people in New York, right? They would kick up the money along the line. And if you forgot to kick money up along the line, then the people up the line would come to visit you to re-explain how the system was supposed to work, right? That was the same system. I'm not kidding. That was the same system from being a count, a duke, an earl, a lord, right? That was the same system where they kick money up to the king. It's called a fee estate, right? You see, we're keeping you up to date with the latest that's happening in real estate. The fee estate, called an absolute, doesn't have any qualifications. It's not defeasible. It is the greatest degree of ownership. It is indefinite in duration. Defeasible means there are conditions or limitations, and they're sometimes called a condition subsequent. Subsequent means after. So this is a condition where if afterward you break it, you lose your title. And the example, as I've already mentioned, is somebody giving title on the condition that no alcohol is sold. Precedent conditions, which is something you have to do before you can own it, are not recognized in California. Why then do I have it in my outline? And the answer is because the Department of Real Estate puts it in as an answer choice. The Department of Real Estate in California, they're kind of messed up. And one of the things they realize is that most of the people and much of the material that is used to prepare people to take the state exam is done by national companies. And where I'm going with this is, for example, I've had a broker's license in Nevada. I used to teach these classes in Nevada to people that wanted to get a Nevada license. And Nevada, like most states, has a two-tiered exam. First, there's a national test. The national test is a generic real estate test, but then there's a second test. You take two tests, and the second test is on Nevada law. Oregon, same thing. Washington, same thing. Texas, same thing. Most states use this system, but not California. Right? So California doesn't let other people write the questions for them. They should, but they don't. They write their own questions. And so what the Department of Real Estate has done, just because they're evil people, is they've gone through some of the material that people might be studying that is of the national nature, but doesn't apply to California. And they stick some of that stuff in the California test to throw you off. So in many states and in national study materials, you're going to learn about a condition precedent, which is you get married and then you get the property. You graduate from college, then you get the property. Precedent conditions are not recognized in California, but the Department of Real Estate wants to see, will you pick it? Because if you're studying material that wasn't designed just for California, you might have learned about something that doesn't exist in California. They do that just because that's just the way they are. A life estate. Think of a life estate like there's a clock ticking, like an 8-timer, kind of a clock. And when the clock stops ticking, the estate moves. Now, what makes this a bit morbid is the clock, well, it's a person's life. Now, is this something that you're going to see? No. The only time these days that we see life estates, and I have a diagram as an example, which is not going to be on the state exam. I'm going to cover it on the state exam. But let's say I want to donate my property to a charity, but I'm not dead and I want a place to live. What I can do is donate the property to the charity, but reserve a life estate, which means for my life, I get to live there. But when I die, it immediately and automatically moves on to the charity. The Department of State doesn't care about that, even though it's the only practical use of it these days, but they just like to ask questions about life estates. They just do. So there's a holder of the life estate who's called a life tenant, has possession and use. Waste means you're not supposed to trash it. You can sell, encumber, or lease it, but only for the duration of the life estate. You have an estate in property, but you cannot will it, because if it's based on your life, but you could if it's based on another. Let's look at an example. So A deeds to B for B's life, then back to A. Why would somebody do this? Right now, this is not a normal thing. It's not a common thing. And one of the frustrating things about studying for the real estate exam is you read stuff and you're trying to make it fit some practical understanding of the real estate business, because a lot of times it doesn't. Right? It's just stuff that the Department of Real Estate has decided they want to ask questions about. But let's say I have a widowed mother and she needs a place to live. So I could just give her a house. Let's say I have a house, that a rental that, the tenants are, I could just give her the house, because she'll give it back to me, won't she? In her will. I can rely on that, couldn't I? I mean, she's not going to give it to my brother or somebody like that. I mean, she will remember I'm the one who gave it to her, right? I mean, it's true, she sometimes calls me by his name, but I'm sure she'll remember, right, when she's writing her will, that I'm the one that gave it to her. And she's not going to lose it or anything, would she? I mean, she keeps going to those casinos and things like that. I'm sure she wouldn't double down too often, and I'm sure she would do that. And she's unlikely to get married again, but there's, this guy she goes to the casinos with. You see my problem? I might not ever get it back. So I deed it to her for her life. And when she dies, it immediately and automatically comes back to me. That would be a life estate. Now, if I'm A, am the grantor, and I have something called an estate in reversion, it comes back to me. She is the life tenant and the clock. Now, you might think calling somebody the clock is rude. The law calls her the measuring life, which I think is kind of rude too. But anyhow, look at the next example. And by the way, these are examples. The Department of Real Estate puts stuff like this on their test. A deeds to B for the life of C, and then the remainder to D. All right, so I'm not going to give mom the house because I know she'll trash it. I'm going to give it to my Aunt Mabel, who's taking care of mom. It'll give Mabel the incentive to make sure she has her vitamins and take her for walks. But when mom dies, I don't want the house back. It can go to my nephew, Dennis, right? So who's got an interest in the property? That's the game we're going to play. Does A have an interest in the property in this example? Does A, when it's over, have an interest in the property? Answer is no. What does A have? A has a memory, right? A deeded to B for the life of C and then to D, right? It's just the grantor who created the mess. Does B have an interest in the property? It says A deeds to B. Sounds like B owns something. B is the life tenant. Does C have an interest in the property? The answer is no. The C is the clock, right? The measuring life doesn't have an interest in the property. Does D have an interest in the property? The answer is yes. It's called a remainder. So if the interest goes back to the original owner, the original grantor, it's called a reversion. If it's a remainder, it's held by a third party. It goes to somebody else. Can you inherit a life estate. Can you inherit a life estate? Look at this. A deeds to B for the life. What happens if B dies? But C is still alive and ticking. The answer is B's heirs would inherit the life estate. Then on the state exam, if the holder of the life estate, the life tenant, dies before the designated person, not the life tenant, the property goes to the heirs of the life tenant. Then we have what are called less than freehold estates. Less than freehold are the lease estates. They're also called, and this is really common on the state exam, a chattel real. What kind of property does the word chattel refer to? Personal property, right? You need to know that for the state exam. The chances that the Department of Real Estate is going to want you to connect personal property to the word chattel is really, really, really high. So the word chattel refers to personal property. What kind of property does the word real refer to? Real property. So a chattel real is personal, real property. Boy, this sounds bad already, doesn't it? It just sounds bad. I'll explain what that means in a minute. So we have four kinds of leasehold estates. There's the estate for years, the periodic tenancy, the estate at will, and the estate at sufferance. There's a question, the Department of Real Estate has a question that says, what example would convert a freehold estate into a less than freehold estate? And the answer is a sale with a lease back. So if I have a fee simple estate and I sold it to you, but then I rented the property back from you, I would have converted a fee simple estate into a less than freehold estate. So the types of a leasehold estate, there's the estate for years, which is for a definite period fixed in advance. No notice to terminate is required. Why not? Because it's a definite period fixed in advance. But notice it says it could be for days, weeks, months, or years. All right. English common law. They made a distinction between somebody that was a boarder, like renting a room at the inn, versus somebody who was a tenant. Tenants had rights. People that rented a room at the hotel or the inn did not have rights. Under English common law, in order for you to acquire the rights of a tenant, your lease had to be for more than a year. So the English called it an estate for years. Now, the California Civil Code repeats the phrase estate for years, but they do not mean an estate for years. What they mean is an estate, a lease estate for a fixed period of time. There's a question on the state exam about a pastry shop. And in the question, it says that there is a 6-month lease on the pastry shop. The Department of Real Estate asks, what kind of estate does the tenant have? And the answer is an estate for years. Now you might be saying, but no, it's not. It's only for 6 months. It's a definite and fixed period of time. It doesn't actually have to be for years. It's just confusing. Periodic tenancy is a month to month. It continues periodically. It renews, but a notice to terminate is required. So if I have a 6-month lease, I don't have to tell the landlord I'm leaving in 6 months because it's a 6-month lease. But if I have a month to month, I have to tell the landlord when I'm leaving. An estate at will is simply something that doesn't fit into the other categories. Supposing somebody is staying in the guest room of your house, you haven't signed the lease, they're not paying you rent. They have what's called an estate at will. You didn't kidnap them, hopefully. They didn't break in, right? You know, it's called an estate at will. And an estate at sufferance is a holdover tenant. Somebody has a 6-month lease, but they don't leave. They don't leave. That is, why is it called sufferance? All right. Suffer literally means to allow something to be done to you. The reason they call this an estate at sufferance is because landlords cannot evict tenants in California. I know it seems like a bold statement, but technically true. The word evict means to throw somebody out. Landlords don't do that. Sheriffs, marshals, but mostly sheriffs do that. So if my lease is up, can the landlord wait for me to go to work and then open up the door of my apartment and move all my stuff out and change the law? The answer is no, they can't do that. They have to suffer. So they have to follow, and we're going to talk about that system in a different class when we talk about leases. We're going to talk about that in a different class, but the landlord has to hire a lawyer, go to court, and get an eviction, go through, it's called unlawful detainer, and then people with guns and badges are going to eventually come to throw me out, and you suffer. Acceptance of the rent by the landlord constitutes consent, right? So if somebody owes you rent and they say, oh, I can't pay you everything, right? But here's $500, let me do something. If you want to get rid of them, don't take the money. Because if you take the money, you're not suffering enough. You're not suffering enough. Let me just cover one more thing before we go on. I'll go through my summary. Chattel, real. Right, remember that? Chattel means personal property, real means real property. The reason why that is applied to leases, and this is also why leases are covered twice in my classes, is because a lease is considered hybrid in that it's two different animals kind of stuck together. In that a lease creates a estate in land. That's the real property part. But a lease is also a contract, which is why I talk about it in contracts class. The contract part of a lease is personal property. The property, a lease of real property is personal property. A lease of real property is personal property. Think of it like a car lease. Is there a difference between a car lease and a car? Yeah, right? I mean, if I have a car and I'm leasing it and I ruin the car, I still got a lease, right? You wouldn't call the car lease transportation. The car is transportation. So there's a difference between the lease of the car and the car. There's a difference between a house lease and a house. The house is real property, but the lease is personal property. And we'll talk more about leases as a contract in a different class. Less than freehold estates. This summarizes, what I've been going on about. An estate for years is a fixed period of time, no notice to terminate. Periodic is period to period. You got to terminate it with a notice. Estate at will is terminated by will, and the estate at sufferance is a holdover tenant terminated by legal action. Title vestings is how it is owned. Tenancy is a mode or method of holding a title. Two ways in which you can hold title: all by yourself. If you hold it all by yourself, that's severalty. Now that may seem contradictory because severalty kind of sounds like there would be several of us, but it doesn't mean several, it means severed. And if I've severed myself from everyone else, I'm all alone. Or I could own it with other people. That's called concurrent, simultaneous ownership by two or more persons. Undivided interest severed by a partition action. An attorney should give advice on how to take title. There was a question in the state exam about brothers and sisters, and it could be fee simple or a joint tenancy. Joint tenancy comes from England, as much of our stuff does. It's two or more persons. They are joint and equal owners of an undivided interest. It is a single estate. There is only one title. The distinguishing characteristic is called right of survivorship. One dies, the other ones get it. In order to create a joint tenancy, there are 4 unities: time, title, interest, and possession, TTIP, TTIP. Everybody has to acquire title at the same time in the same document with equal interest and equal rights of possession. The fiction is if there's 4 of us or 3 of us, we are owning it as though we are one person. It can't be willed. It's not controlled by probate. Not liable to creditors if they haven't foreclosed. You can sell your shares with others without the consent of others. The person that buys it would be a tenant in common. Corporations can't be joint tenants with a natural person because they don't die, and it just wouldn't be fair. Husbands and wives may deed property to themselves or others as joint tenants. Now, one reason that married couples deed property to themselves as joint tenants is because of the right of survivorship. You don't have to go through will and probate, right? Isn't that great? But this causes problems. One of the famous cases about this, a husband and wife own a house, only significant property they've got, as joint tenants. Both of them had children from a previous marriage. The husband's will says, I leave everything to my kids. The wife's will says, I leave everything to my kids. But they own everything as joint tenants. Well, they died in the same automobile accident. So what happens? They died at the same time, right? Right of survivorship, who gets it? Now, what the court wanted to do, and the wife's children were cool with this, was they wanted to take the property and split it in half and give half to the husband's kids and half to the wife's kids. Well, the husband's kids weren't going with it. And what they did is they hired a lawyer who hired an investigator, and this is what they argued in court. They argued that evidence from the crash scene seemed to show that the stepmother had died instantly in the car accident, but that their father had crawled away from the wreck. So what they argued was when the stepmom was dead, her interest immediately and automatically transferred to their father, and when he died, they inherited anything. And the court reluctantly gave the husband's kid the property, because if one joint tenant outlasts the other joint tenant by any measurable length of time, the right of survivorship kicks in and it's an automatic transfer. Can you see the downside to a system like this? They like to ask this on the state exam. They've been doing a lot more Latin lately. Et ux means and wife. I wouldn't necessarily throw that around a lot. Hey, ux, you know. Et al means and others, which are sometimes used. So if it's a joint tenancy, we have A, B, C, and D. They own property as joint tenants. They all have a 25% interest. A dies. So A's interest immediately and automatically is transferred to the 3 surviving joint tenants. They now all have 1/3. D sells his interest to E. E is not a joint tenant because E did not take title at the same time in the same document that B and C did. But B and C are still joint tenants because they meet the TTIP. They took title at the same time in the same document. They have equal rights and equal possession. B dies. B's interest goes to C. C now has 2/3. E ends up with 1/3. They're tenants in common. Speaking of tenancy in common, 2 or more persons, undivided interest. They don't own any specific part, and only one instrument is necessary. Instrument means like a piece of paper, like one deed. So in joint tenancy, everybody has to have an equal interest. In tenants in common, one person can have 60 and the other one can have 40. You can leave it to anybody you wanted to. You don't have to go through there's no right of survivorship. Each has a right of possession. That is the only unity. The only thing that has to be equal is the right of possession. They could have unequal ownership interests. They can sell without the other's consent. They have to pay their own expenses. So if we have A, B, and C as tenants in common, A owns 25, B owns 25, C owns 50, C sells to D, D now owns 50, A dies, he leaves it to his heir E, now they're all tenancy in common. So joint tenancy is TTIP for unities. Tenancy in common is just P, just possession. Community property. How do we have community property in California? And the answer is, well, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 brought the end of the Mexican-American War. Mexico had it, they got it from Spain, and actually Germany, I think, originally had it, but anyhow. Most states in the United States do not have community property laws. Only about 8 or 9 states have community property laws. And most of them, the states that do have community property laws, were states where there was a Spanish or Mexican interest. But there's some exceptions, Minnesota and Massachusetts, right? You know, Minnesota, they think the Vikings went there, but not the Spaniards, so I don't know. But anyhow, a couple of weird states do it, but most of them are predictable ones. Now, each spouse is 50-50, right? Separate property, which is not community property, is property that you acquired before marriage or after marriage by gift or inheritance. So it's possible for the husband to have property, the wife to have property, and for them to have community property, right? These are all different entities. You can sell with the other one's consent. How about this? If the husband or wife buys encumbered real property without the other's consent, it's voidable by 1 year by the injured spouse because it's binding the whole community to the debt. If the husband or wife sells community real property without the other's consent, the injured spouse has a year to void the sale. It's unenforceable. But a husband or wife can lease for 1 year or less community property without the other's consent. You can dispose of your interest by will. So if the deed says husband and wife, it's considered to be community property. This is sort of a memory gimmick I have. If it's community property, it takes 1 to list, but 2 to sell. Either spouse can list property without the other's consent, because a listing in the sense is not a real estate contract, it's an employment agreement. Either one can do that, but it takes 2 to sell. Without the other spouse's consent, they cannot SEL the property. You can't sell it, you can't encumber it, which means to borrow money against it, and you can't lease it for more than a year. So tenancy in common, 2 or more parties, could be natural, could be legal, equal possession. Interests do not have to be equal, but they're undivided. What that means is that if you own 90% and somebody else owns 10%, the person with 10% doesn't get 10% of the property or the whole property 10% of the time. They have a 10% interest in the whole property the whole time. Title can be separate. Everyone can have their own deed, death, will, or probate. Joint tenancy is 2 or more natural people, equal possession, equal interest. They have to take title at the same time in the same document, and they have the right of survivorship. Community properties are husbands and wives, or husbands and husbands, and wives, or domestic partners. Anybody legally married or domestic partners qualify. Equal possession, equal interest. Title is in the community. It's a different thing. And in community property, you can have a right of survivorship. It could be will or probate, but it could be the right of survivorship. You don't want to give people advice on how to take title. And one of the things I've noticed, less so recently, but I've noticed, is many real estate agents will say, well, everybody thinks title is joint tenancy if they're married, so maybe you ought to do that. You know, why not? Right, there's a downside. This has got legal, and I'll give you an example. A husband and wife bought an investment property 10 years ago. They paid $500,000. It's worth $1 million today. That means the property has $500,000 of capital gain. If they had bought the investment property and held the title as joint tenants, and let's say the husband dies, for purposes of determining capital gain, the husband's half interest the basis is going to be stepped up to whatever the value of the property was when the husband died. The basis is what's used to determine capital gain. So the husband's 250,000 half of gain is wiped out because the basis for the husband's half is raised to what the value is when the husband died. But the wife's half, the wife has always had that half. So if the wife sold the property soon after the husband's death, there would be a capital gains tax on $250,000, her half of the gain, because her half hadn't been stepped up. If they had bought that same property and took title as community property, title is in the community, not in the individuals. So when the husband dies, the community dies, which means for tax purposes, the entire basis is stepped up to the value of the property at the time of the husband's death. So if the wife then sold it for $1 million shortly thereafter, there would be no capital gains tax, right? None. But if it was joint tenancy, half. Do you understand why you don't want to give people advice about this? Because there are serious tax implications depending on how you hold the title. Syndicates. You've got a commercial property and I call you up and I say, I got a buyer. The buyer is going to be using syndicate money, right? And you've just been, watching The Sopranos or whatever, and like, oh yeah, they're coming for me. Well, the word syndicate comes from two Greek words, syn, S-Y-N, which means together, and dicate, which means to speak. So a syndicate speaks or acts as one. It's a group purchase. There are partnerships and corporations and all these other things. It is the best approach to solve the problem of non-liquidity. And it has greater leverage. All right. So where do you think the highest rate of return typically is in real estate investments? We're talking about a percentage. Is it in big investments or small investments? I guess another way of putting it is it possible as a percentage? I could buy small investments and then sell them and get a percentage higher return than bigger investments. Now, if you're thinking, yeah, I think that's possible and likely, then you're thinking that we are making more money in real estate than Warren Buffett, right? Because he's all messed up and he's always buying these big things, right? But we may not be. You understand that the bigger the investment, the higher the risk. The higher the risk, the higher the rate of return. So let's say a $15 million commercial investment. Big risk, big rate of return. However, our problem might be that we haven't saved $15 million. That might be a problem. Now, maybe of all of us, that were, in the class tonight, let's say we all pooled our money together. Well, we might be short, but let's just assume if we all pooled our money together, we could raise the 15 million. So what that would do by us making a group purchase, it would allow us to buy properties in an upper tier, which generally has a higher rate of return. Now, liquidity means how quickly can I get my money out of an investment? Well, if I had 15 million and I bought a $15 million property, but I needed money soon, what am I going to do? Sell the $15 million? It could take a really long time to do that. So I don't have a really good way of getting my money out. But let's say we created a corporation and the corporation bought the $15 million property, and all I would then need to do is sell my shares in the corporation. Well, that wouldn't take as long. So it solves the problem of liquidity and it allows greater leverage. Leverage means OPM, other people's money, right? That's what leverage means, buying something with other people's money. On the state exam, they usually just talk about corporations, real estate investment trusts, a general and limited partnership. A corporation is an artificial being. The stockholders have limited liability. So if you've got all of your money in a corporation and it collapses and it goes broke and it's bankrupt, your stock is worthless, but they're not going to come to you and ask you to pay the hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. You have limited liability. The disadvantage is the potential for double taxation. And what that means is the corporation is an artificial being, and so when it earns money, it's supposed to pay a tax. Supposed to. And as a shareholder, when I get dividends, I'm a person too, so I have to pay a tax. So in a way, it's taxed twice, unless it's a subchapter S corporation, which is a mom and pop. That's what it's referred to, where there aren't, it's not like Apple or something like that. There's only 2 or 3 or 4 of us, and we set it up for liability and other purposes and that sort of thing. A general partnership, each partner's assets are liable for the debts, right? Jointly and severally. Each partner can participate in the management. Limited partnerships are similar, except you're limited in that you're not liable for the debts of the business, but you can not participate in management. Right? There's got to be a general partner. So one of the differences is taxation. So if it's a corporate, the corporate income is taxed and the dividends is taxed. If it's a partnership, the partnership is not a taxable entity. So the partnership pays no tax, but the partners do. Limited liability corporations hasn't been on the state exam, but you know, who knows? It's far more common. The thing about a liability, limited liability, the limited liability company pays no taxes. The tax liabilities pass directly to the members. Right? So it's done to keep your business assets separate, that sort of thing. Trusts, there's many different kinds of trusts. There's living trusts, and then there's what's called a vested trust, where somebody dies and somebody's taking over it. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about other kinds of trusts. But a trust has to have a trustor, a trustee, and a beneficiary. A real estate investment trust is a special kind of corporation with a tax dodge. It's a federal thing. Trust is not taxed on the profits, but the investors are taxed when they take money out. And that brings us to the end of this particular session. Now, if this is your first time or not, I usually spend a few minutes explaining how the course works. If you're taking the state exam relatively soon, some of this may be of interest to you. If you're just getting started, all of it might be of interest to you. So to get a real estate license, you have to do 3 things. One is you have to complete 3 college level courses in real estate. You don't have to go to college, right? Those are all bundled into the program I have. You 2 have to pass the state exam, and then 3, you can apply for a license. The 3 college courses, one of them has to be real estate principles, one of them has to be real estate practice, and the third one is an elective. And the elective can come from anything that's on this list. Accounting, economics, and business law is on the list. They're on the list. Which means if you've ever taken accounting, economics, or business law from a junior college or better, and you can get your hands on a copy of the transcripts, it doesn't have to be an original. We're not applying to Harvard. You've got the 3rd course. If you don't have accounting, economics, or business law, or you can't get a copy of your transcript, don't worry. Legal aspects of real estate law is included as part of the bundle, and it's the one the Department of Real Estate is going to ask the most questions about. The college level courses, each of the 3 is a 45-hour course, which means 135 hours of pre-licensed training. And the company that I'm affiliated with is approved by the California Department of Real Estate to offer the courses and issue the certificates of completion. The program, the 3 college level courses, are online courses. Each course has a final exam. So there's 3 courses, 3 final exams. The final exams are online final exams. You can take the final exam at home, and it's an open book test. Let me cover that one more time. The final exams for the 3 college level courses are online, at home, open book, cheat as much as you want to. Final exams, you can cheat as much as you want to. They give you 3 hours to get 75 out of 100 questions right. Did I mention that this is an open book test? Now, the Department of Real Estate makes you wait 18 days from when you start a course before you can take the final exam. That doesn't mean you have to take the final exam in 18 days. It just means you can't take the final exam any sooner than 18 days. The reason they do that, it's supposed to be a 45-hour course, and you could pass, well, tonight. You understand, if we gave you the book and internet connection and phone a friend and you had 3 hours, you could find 75 answers by just looking them up. You could find 75 answers and pass the test, which makes the whole 45-hour thing kind of ridiculous. So you have to wait 18 days. Now, this is not the hard part of getting a real estate license. This is not the hard part, right? Online, open book, cheat as much as you want to. This is the easy part of getting a real estate license. The hard part is passing the real estate exam. The real estate exam is not an online open book, cheat as much as you want to test. You have to go to one of the Department of Real Estate testing facilities there in Oakland, Sacramento, Fresno, Orange County, San Diego. Physically, you have to go there. The question, it's 150 questions, it's 3 hours long. You have to get 70% of the questions right in order to pass. Now, if you think about it, that's not a particularly high score to require. If you were laying on the operating table and your brain surgeon came in and announced that, oh, I may be new, but don't worry, I passed the brain surgeon's exam, I got 70%. Oh, nailed that test. That doesn't sound very good for a brain surgeon, does it? Because it means that the brain surgeon missed more than 1 out of every 4 questions they were asked about the subject of brain surgery. That doesn't sound very good. But you don't have to be a brain surgeon in order to get a real estate license. You might have noticed that. You don't have to be a brain surgeon. All you have to do is get 70% of the questions right and you're in. Having said that, however, every time the Department of Real Estate gives this test, they fail more than half the people that are in the room, many of whom they have failed before. You can take the test an unlimited number of times. I've met too many people that have taken the test more than 10 times. They finally thought, maybe I ought to take a course. I don't know. You know? So all these people that are failing, I wonder how many of them were able to successfully complete the 3 online open book, cheat as much as you want to, college level courses. The answer is they all did. You can't take this test unless you've done the 3 college courses. The point I'm making is doing the 3 college courses does not mean you're getting a real estate license. It simply means you've done the minimum amount necessary to go take a shot at the exam. What I do is I teach people how to pass the test. I have classes on Wednesday nights, 6:30 to 8:45, focused on what you need to know to pass the exam, broadcast on the internet and recorded. It's like a pizza, warm and cheesy, and like a pizza in that there is no first line. Each class is taught as an independent module. Right? Last week was number 12, this week is number 1, next week is number 2. It goes on and on and on. You can start with any one of them. You could take them in any order. The investment for the whole program is $398. It includes the live classes, the video replays, the course outline, the practice testing, the college level courses, and the Saturday cram class before you go take the test. I have good reviews. Right? I've been doing this for a long time. I have a really high pass rate. Virtually everyone who goes to the course passes the state exam. I'm focused on California, as opposed to just modifying national materials. And I'm with a company called EXP. I have a team of agents that from San Diego all throughout California. And when you pass the exam, talk to me about how to get started in that. How long does the process take? Well, each college level course takes a minimum of 18 days. That would be 54 days to complete all three. If you had done that today and applied to take the state exam, it's 4 to 6 weeks before you can take the test. While you're waiting for your test date, you would start the fingerprint processing part, which is 6 weeks. Once you've passed the test, it's going to take about 2 weeks to get a license. Let's say 4 to 6 months, typical. How much does it cost? $398 to go through the course, $305 to take the test and to get a license issued, $75 roughly for fingerprinting and processing, $778. In addition, once you're licensed, there's the Board of Realtors and the multiple listing service, which are necessary if you're selling residential real estate, and that's what the annual amounts, roughly speaking, are. I would also like to point out, however, that our average commission to an agent is more than $20,000. I just thought I would say that. Once you get your license, it's good for 4 years. Every 4 years, you have to renew it. If you wanted to sign up, and who wouldn't want to sign up now, you go to my website, dreclass.com, click on sign up now. There are 3 options. If you're just beginning the journey, it's going to be the first option where you have college level and the license preparation part. If you're about to take the state exam and you just want the workshop and the testing that goes with it, that's only $99. The middle group is for people that have done the college level courses a really long time ago. They don't really remember everything. They don't need to do it again because those courses are good forever, but they want to learn how to pass the test. If you have any questions, reach out. That's email, phone number to call the office, the website. There's a calendar link which you could use if you want to talk to me. Click on the link, set up an appointment. Let's talk. That's all I got for this evening. Everybody, I want you to stay safe out there. And it's still a really good time to get into real estate. Reach out to me if you'd like to talk. Have a good night, everyone. Bye.